After the Roman Empire collapsed, its pieces became different countries, but China should have ended the same way. Rome fell, and Western Europe became a continent of separate kingdoms, with new borders and rulers. The old empire survived through law, religion, and memory, but the original political map never returned. China should have followed the same path, yet its broken pieces kept moving back toward unity. When the Han Dynasty collapsed in 220, China entered centuries of wars between rival states. Wei ruled the north, Shu controlled the southwest, and Wu dominated the lower Yangtze region. These kingdoms had their own rulers, armies, capitals, officials, and systems of collecting taxes. They were not temporary rebellions because they already possessed almost everything a permanent country needed. Yet after these kingdoms disappeared, China still did not remain permanently divided into separate nations. The Jin dynasty rebuilt a unified empire briefly, before another civil war destroyed that achievement. Northern and southern China remained separated for generations, creating enough time for new identities. A person could be born, grow old, and die without ever seeing China reunify. That was more than enough time for separate countries to form and survive permanently. This happened after Rome, after the Mongol Empire, and after many other great empires collapsed. But in China, the pieces repeatedly tried to become one state again. The strange question is not why China collapsed, but why the pieces kept returning together. China did not avoid destruction, invasion, rebellion, or centuries of political division. The difference was what happened after every collapse ended. After Rome fell, its former territories gradually accepted many independent kingdoms. France, England, Spain, and other regions developed their own permanent political identities. A French ruler could govern France without trying to rebuild the entire Roman Empire. An English king could rule England without claiming authority over all Europe. Multiple kings could exist together because several political centers became legitimate. China developed a different political expectation after its own imperial collapses. Regional rulers were not only protecting their own territories and survival, they were competing for the highest position inside the entire political system. A powerful kingdom was still considered incomplete without controlling the central empire. The ultimate reward was not ruling one region, but ruling all China. This competition shaped Chinese history through thousands of years of dynasties and wars. To understand this pattern, we need to return to the beginning of Chinese empire. The first reason China kept rebuilding was something most people never notice: the written language. China was not held together only by borders, armies, or rulers who came and went. It was also held together by a shared system of writing across different regions. A farmer in northern China and a merchant in the south could speak differently, but they could still read the same characters and understand the same historical records. This created a connection that survived even when governments completely collapsed. When one dynasty disappeared, old books and ideas did not disappear with it. A scholar in one kingdom could still understand scholars living hundreds of miles away. The political system could break, but the cultural memory remained alive. This was very different from what happened after the fall of Rome. Latin slowly transformed into different European languages and separate identities. French, Spanish, Italian, and others became their own cultural worlds. China's written language preserved a continuous story across thousands of years. The people changing governments still believed they were rebuilding the same civilization. The next piece of the puzzle was not language, but political legitimacy. Every Chinese dynasty operated on a similar idea about why rulers deserved power. This idea was called the Mandate of Heaven, and it changed Chinese politics forever. The emperor ruled because heaven had chosen him to bring order to the world. But this power was never considered permanent or guaranteed forever. If rulers failed, Disasters and chaos were seen as signs they had lost legitimacy. Floods, famine, corruption, and rebellion could prove a dynasty had failed. A new leader could defeat the old one and claim heaven's approval. This created a cycle of collapse, replacement, and rebuilding throughout Chinese history. A successful ruler did not only need an army to win battles, he also needed to convince people that he represented a new order. This system created a powerful pressure toward reunification after every collapse. A regional ruler controlling half of China was still incomplete. The ultimate goal was always becoming the ruler of the entire empire. That was why divided kingdoms kept fighting instead of accepting permanent separation. The competition was not only for land, but for historical legitimacy. When a new dynasty won, it usually kept many systems from the previous one. The government structure, written records, and administrative traditions continued across dynasties. New rulers changed the family on the throne, but not the entire civilization. This created a surprising pattern after every major collapse. The country could lose a dynasty without losing the idea of China. A foreign conqueror could take power and still adopt Chinese institutions. The Mongols created the Yuan dynasty, but they ruled through Chinese administration. The Manchus conquered China and created the Qing dynasty centuries later. But they also continued using many Chinese political traditions. The conquerors changed rulers, but the system absorbed them. This made China different from many empires that disappeared after invasion. The conqueror did not always replace China with something completely new. Instead, the conqueror often became the next chapter of Chinese history. This ability to absorb new rulers helped China survive repeated destruction. But political systems alone cannot explain everything. Another reason was geography and the way people lived across the land. China developed around large river systems that connected huge farming regions. The Yellow River and Yangtze River became the backbone of Chinese civilization. Millions of farmers depended on the same agricultural cycles and water systems. A divided China still shared the same economic foundation across regions. Rulers understood that controlling China meant managing these connected resources. Food, taxes, and transportation all depended on keeping the country connected. This made a large, unified government extremely valuable. A smaller kingdom could survive, but it struggled to compete with a unified empire. The ruler, controlling the whole system, gained enormous advantages over rivals. China's geography encouraged rulers to think in terms of one large state. Europe developed differently because mountains, seas, and borders separated regions. Many European kingdoms had fewer reasons to become one political unit. Different languages and identities became stronger over centuries of separation. China faced a different historical pressure. Reunification often created more benefits than division. For ancient rulers, reunification was not only an ambition, it was practical. A unified empire could collect taxes from a much larger population. It could build roads, canals, and defenses across enormous distances. It could move soldiers and supplies faster during major conflicts. A divided country often lost these advantages to internal competition. Rival kingdoms spent resources fighting each other instead of developing together. This created a cycle where division weakened states and encouraged new unifiers. The winner of a civil war often inherited a stronger foundation than before. Every successful reunification became proof that unity created power. This memory influenced future generations of rulers and officials. They saw previous unified dynasties as models to restore. The idea of rebuilding a great empire became part of political thinking. Even foreign conquerors understood they needed to control the whole system. Simply ruling one region was rarely enough to be considered legitimate. The political reward always pushed leaders toward another reunification attempt. The first major example appeared more than 2,000 years ago during the Qin dynasty. Before Qin, China was divided among powerful states competing for survival. Qin did something revolutionary. It did not just conquer rivals, it created a new structure to govern the entire territory together. Standardized writing, measurements, and laws connected different regions. The Qin dynasty was short, but its model survived. The Han dynasty inherited and expanded many of these ideas. For the first time, a unified Chinese state became a long-term expectation. Later rulers no longer asked whether China should be united. They asked how they could become the ruler who united it. This changed the meaning of political competition completely. Winning a regional war was no longer the final goal. The final goal was rebuilding the entire political order. This pattern repeated through many later dynasties and conflicts. Each collapse created another opportunity for someone to reunify China. After the Han dynasty collapsed, China entered another long period of division. The three kingdoms eventually disappeared, but unity did not immediately return. For centuries, northern and southern governments competed for power. Many people expected this division to become permanent, but another dynasty eventually changed the situation again. The Sui dynasty reunited China after nearly 4 centuries of separation. The Tang dynasty then expanded this unified system into one of history's greatest empires. The pattern was becoming clear. Collapse did not erase the structure. It created a competition to rebuild something larger. The same process happened again after the Tang dynasty fell. The 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms period created another age of fragmentation, but the Song dynasty eventually rebuilt a powerful, centralized government. China did not reunify because wars stopped happening. China reunified because someone always benefited from restoring the whole system. The structure itself kept creating new unifiers. The next major test came from outside China, not from internal rebellion. In the 13th century, the Mongols conquered huge parts of Eurasia. They destroyed many kingdoms and created the largest land empire in history. When they conquered China, many expected the old system to disappear. Instead, the Mongols created the Yuan dynasty and adopted Chinese administration. They changed the ruling family, but they did not remove the entire system. The empire still needed Chinese officials, taxation, and local governance. The conquerors discovered that ruling China required understanding China. They could control the throne, but they needed the system beneath it. This was another example of absorption instead of complete replacement. Centuries later, the Manchus faced the same challenge after entering China. They established the Qing dynasty and ruled for nearly 3 centuries. But they also preserved many Chinese institutions and traditions. The pattern repeated. New rulers entered, but China absorbed them. The civilization survived because it could incorporate different rulers. But this raises another question. What happened when the imperial system finally ended? In many parts of the world, the collapse of monarchy created permanent political fragmentation. China faced the same danger after the Qing dynasty fell in 1912. The old emperor disappeared, and the country entered a period of uncertainty. Regional military leaders gained control over different parts of China. For a moment, China looked like it might follow the same path as other collapsed empires. Different regions had different armies, leaders, and political interests. But the idea of one China never completely disappeared. Political movements continued to compete over who could rebuild national unity. The struggle was no longer about restoring an emperor. It became a competition to create a modern version of a unified state. Even after decades of conflict, the country moved toward another centralized government. The form of government changed, but the search for unity continued. This showed that the pattern was deeper than any single dynasty. The idea of China was larger than the rulers who controlled it. After thousands of years, the pattern becomes easier to see. China did not survive because it avoided collapse. It survived because collapse was followed by reconstruction. The civilization had mechanisms that encouraged rebuilding instead of permanent separation. Shared writing connected people across different regions and generations. Political traditions encouraged rulers to seek one central authority. Geography made large-scale unity economically valuable. Institutions allowed new rulers to inherit and adapt existing systems. Every collapse created destruction, but also created another opportunity. Someone would eventually gain enough power to reunite the country. This does not mean China was always peaceful or stable. Chinese history was filled with wars, disasters, and suffering. The surprising part is what happened after those disasters. The country repeatedly rebuilt a larger political order from the ruins. That is the mystery behind China's repeated reunifications. The answer is not one single event, one emperor, or one dynasty. It was a combination of culture, geography, institutions, and political ideas. Together, these forces made reunification possible again and again. China's history was not a straight line of continuous success. It was a cycle of collapse, competition, rebuilding, and renewal. The dynasty changed, but many foundations remained in place. The rulers changed, but the civilization continued to adapt. This explains why China could disappear politically, but survive culturally. The state could fall, but the idea of China remained. And when conditions changed, someone always tried to rebuild it. This pattern is one of the most unusual stories in human history. Few civilizations experience so many collapses and recoveries over such a long period. Understanding this pattern helps explain China's past and its present. The story of China is not only about surviving disasters, it is about how a civilization repeatedly rebuilt itself from the ruins. From ancient kingdoms to the modern era, the same pattern appears repeatedly. China experienced enormous destruction, but the civilization kept finding ways to reorganize. The key was not avoiding failure, but recovering after failure. Many great powers disappeared because their political structures could not survive collapse. China repeatedly rebuilt because its structures could be adapted and reused. Different rulers, different dynasties, and different challenges produced similar outcomes. The country changed many times, but the larger framework remained recognizable. This does not mean every period of unity was peaceful or successful. Unity also brought problems, conflicts, and difficult decisions throughout history. But compared with permanent fragmentation, reunification remained a powerful goal. That is why China's history looks different from many other civilizations. It was not a story of never falling apart. It was a story of falling apart and coming back together. The ruins were often the beginning of the next chapter, and that may be the biggest secret behind China's survival. Looking back at thousands of years, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. China repeatedly lost dynasties, but repeatedly rebuilt political unity. The empire changed names, rulers, and borders, but the idea remained. The reason was not one advantage, but several forces working together. Shared culture created connection across enormous distances and generations. Geography made cooperation and integration more valuable than permanent division. Political traditions encouraged every ambitious ruler to seek reunification. Institutions allowed new leaders to rebuild instead of starting from nothing. Together, these forces created one of history's most unusual patterns, a civilization that repeatedly collapsed, yet repeatedly returned. That does not make Chinese history simple or peaceful. It makes Chinese history one of the most fascinating stories in the world. The real mystery was never why China fell apart. The real mystery was why China kept coming back together. And that is why China's story is different from almost any other civilization. Throughout history, many civilizations reached incredible heights before disappearing forever. Their cities remained, their monuments remained, but their political worlds changed permanently. China followed a different historical rhythm after each major collapse. The question was never whether destruction would come again. The question was, who would rebuild after destruction arrived? Every collapse created uncertainty, but also created opportunity. A new generation of leaders could transform chaos into a new order. This cycle continued across thousands of years of Chinese history. The names of dynasties changed, but the pattern remained recognizable. Rise, collapse, division, and reunification became a repeating historical cycle. Understanding this cycle explains a major part of China's historical identity. It explains why collapse was often viewed as temporary rather than final. It explains why reunification remains such a powerful political goal. And it explains why China's story continues to attract global attention today. A civilization survives not only by avoiding collapse, but by rebuilding after it. The story of China is therefore not simply a story of endless strength. It is a story about resilience built through repeated transformation. Every era faced different problems, but the response followed similar patterns. New challenges created new solutions, and new solutions created continuity. From ancient emperors to modern governments, the search for unity continued. The tools changed, but the historical logic remained familiar. A civilization survives when it can adapt after losing everything. China's long history provides one of the clearest examples of this pattern. It shows that collapse alone does not decide the fate of civilizations. What matters is what happens after collapse begins. Some civilizations break apart and never recover their former unity. China repeatedly found ways to rebuild a larger political order. That is the reason reunification appears again and again throughout history. The mystery is not why China fell many times. The mystery is why China kept rising again. The answer lies in thousands of years of adaptation, not in avoiding every disaster. China survived because each collapse became a chance to reorganize society again. The civilization repeatedly turned moments of weakness into new beginnings. Dynasties disappeared, but the broader historical framework continued to evolve. That is why China's reunification was never just a military victory. It was the result of culture, geography, institutions, and political traditions working together. Thousands of years of history created a powerful cycle of separation and reunion. The cycle brought suffering, but it also created continuity. Few civilizations experience such repeated destruction and reconstruction. That unusual pattern shaped how China understood itself through history. From ancient kingdoms to modern China, the same question remained. How can a civilization survive when everything seems to collapse? China's answer was always rebuilding something larger than before. And that may be the deepest reason behind China's repeated reunification. A civilization does not survive because it never falls, but because it rises again.